In the shadows of forgotten temples, behind the paper walls of abandoned homes, and beneath the soil soaked with generations of sorrow, whispers still linger. These are not just ghost stories. They are inherited warnings, whispered regrets, and ancient bindings that refuse to be severed. Here on Whispers of Asia, we do not fear the dark, we listen to it. Each tale we tell is stitched from cultural memory, cursed lullabies, and spirits too restless to sleep. If you've ever felt a chill while walking past a shrine, if you've ever heard a voice in the silence that followed your prayers, you already know. The past is not gone. It's only waiting to be heard. In the isolated mountain village of Kurokami, where the mist never fully lifted and the cedar trees whispered as though repeating old secrets, a girl was born under a moonless sky. Her cries were weak, almost reluctant. The midwife, an old woman with missing teeth and hands that trembled from rituals long past, was the first to notice it. Not the girl's silence, that came later. No, it was the thin crimson thread wound tightly around her ankles. Not tied, not knotted, embedded, as if sewn into her flesh by some unseen hand before she ever took her first breath. Gasps rippled through the room, but no one spoke. The grandmother stepped back, her face paling. The mother, exhausted, sweaty, barely conscious, never saw it. The father wasn't present. That was tradition in Kurokami. Men did not witness birth, especially during Ghost Month. The thread pulsed faintly in the lamplight, like a vein filled with secrets. The midwife whispered a word that only one other person in the room understood. Fukumusubi, a curse older than memory, a thread of binding, a soul that was already claimed. They should have burned the child that night. That was the ancient way. But the old customs had fallen silent, buried beneath years of convenience and fear. And so the baby girl was swaddled in silence and lies, and the red thread remained. They named her Aika. She did not cry again after her birth, not once. Neighbors came bearing rice and incense, peeking into the cradle with uneasy smiles. No one asked about the bandages wrapped around her legs, but behind closed doors, gossip bloomed like mold on wet wood. Born during Ghost Month? She doesn't blink like a normal baby. I heard her thread bleeds when touched. She isn't cursed, she is the curse. Her mother, Naoko, stopped attending local gatherings. Her father, Hiroshi, drank more, and the house at the end of the stone path near the edge of the woods began to rot faster than the rest. Mold crept along the tatami mats. Wooden pillars wept sap like tears. Doors stuck without reason. And the child grew. By the age of 5, Aika had never spoken a word. Not to her parents, not to the other children, not to the mirror, which she often stood in front of for hours. She didn't smile, she didn't laugh, but sometimes, when the wind stirred through the old shoji paper walls, she hummed, a slow, dissonant tune that made the family dog whimper and hide beneath the stairs. But it wasn't her silence that frightened her mother most. It was the thread. By now, it had spread. Thin red lines wove up her calves like creeping ivy. At night, her bed sheets were tangled with it, strands that looped around the legs of her cot, around the frame of the window, around the neck of her old dolls. Once, Naoko tried to snip a piece away while Aika slept. She used a small pair of silver scissors, whispering a protection prayer under her breath. The thread bled. Not the child, the thread. A single droplet of blood welled up from the severed end, dark and syrupy, and dripped onto the tatami floor. The next morning, the scissors were gone. Naoko never found them again. That same night, Hiroshi woke screaming, his ankles ringed with crimson welts as though something had tried to drag him out of bed. They brought in a monk from outside the village. He didn't stay long. He placed a charm above the door, read from a scroll, and tried to bless the house with a cypress branch soaked in sacred water. But when he entered Aika's room, the branch blackened in his hand. The charms curled inward, catching fire at the edges without smoke. He fled before nightfall, leaving behind only one sentence scratched on the floor by his trembling fingers. She was already tied. One day, the thread reached her toes. The next, it began to slither out into the house, like roots hungry for memory. Naoko started hearing footsteps in the walls. Not rats, not wood settling, but footsteps, slow, dragging, soft like cloth on floorboards, always accompanied by the faint sound of sobbing, far away yet close. Sometimes beneath her pillow, sometimes from inside the cabinet, once, terribly, from the hollow beneath the altar where her mother's ashes were kept. Aika, as always, remained silent, but when asked if she'd heard anything, she tilted her head, smiled faintly, and pointed to her ankles. By age 10, she stopped pointing. Now the threads pointed for her. They moved on their own in the night, coiling like worms, slinking across the walls, threading through the cracks in the floorboards. More than once, neighbors found strands of red silk wrapped around their doorknobs. One boy, Akihiro, followed one of the threads all the way back to Aika's gate. He disappeared 3 nights later. His body was found in a field, curled like a fetus, his feet bare and his ankles wrapped in red thread. His mouth was open, stuffed with cotton, his eyes missing. The village grieved, but not loudly, because they knew, because they remembered, because Aika had been born with the thread already in her flesh, and the last child who had been born like that 50 years ago was sealed beneath the shrine and never spoken of again. Until now. Aika's silence had never been empty. It was full, saturated with something ancient, something waiting. And one day, as the season turned and the wind grew heavy with the smell of burning offerings, she stood at the base of the stairs. Her parents were arguing in the kitchen. The air was thick with the scent of soy, sweat, and rot. She opened her mouth, and for the first time, she whispered something. Her voice was so soft, it barely rose above the hum of the fluorescent lights. But it stopped her mother cold, stopped her father mid-sentence, stopped the wind, the house, the breath in Naoko's throat. Aika whispered, "She tied me first."
The house had always creaked. It was old, heavy with time. But after Aika spoke, the creaks changed. They listened. Not just sounds anymore. They became responses, questions, breaths. Naoko noticed it first. She had been walking down the narrow hallway, carrying a tray of miso soup to Aika's room, when the tatami groaned beneath her, not under her own weight, but half a step behind. Then again, a dragging step, soft, damp. She turned, of course. No one. But the feeling remained, like breath on her neck, like memory that didn't belong to her. From that day forward, the house became something else, not haunted, awake. Aika's room was at the far end, past the paper screens and the family altar, a small space, always cold, no matter the season. Her bed sat low to the ground. Her dolls were missing their eyes, and the red thread had grown. It now wrapped around every beam in the room, wound into the corners like a cocoon. Some of it moved gently, as if stirred by air, though the window never opened. Other parts pulsed faintly, like something breathing beneath the wood. Naoko entered carefully. Her feet avoided the thread out of habit now, not because she feared stepping on it, but because it recoiled when touched. Aika sat at the edge of her futon, unmoving, staring at the corner of the ceiling. Her hands were folded in her lap. Her black hair hung over her eyes. Naoko placed the tray down without a word, and the house whispered. A floorboard to her left shifted. Then a slow sigh came from inside the wall. Naoko turned sharply. Her hand shook. "Did you hear that?" Aika said nothing, but one of the threads lifted, just barely, and pointed toward the cabinet. It began happening more frequently after that. When Hiroshi closed the door too hard, the walls groaned, not in protest, but as if mimicking him. When Naoko muttered under her breath, the echo returned a split second later, the exact same words, only in a voice that sounded like hers, but wasn't. When Aika hummed, her tuneless, dissonant lullaby, entire drawers slid open by themselves. Lights flickered. Water in the kitchen sink turned brown. One night, Hiroshi rose to use the toilet. It was raining and the power had gone out. He walked barefoot toward the hallway and paused. The floor beneath him was sticky. He looked down. Thread, red, wet, wrapped around both ankles. He screamed, stumbling backward, but the thread only released when Aika's bedroom door creaked open by itself, revealing her silhouette against the dark, her eyes black hollows of moonlight. She said nothing, and the thread slithered away like it had never been there, and the house exhaled. They tried sleeping in separate rooms after that. Didn't help. The doors locked themselves from the inside. Hiroshi once found Naoko standing at the edge of the kitchen in her nightgown, holding a spoon, barefoot in a puddle of soy sauce. She didn't remember getting up. Another night, Naoko woke to dozens of red threads strung across the room like a spider web, all of them attached to her ankles, wrists, even her hair. She tried to scream, but a single thread was gently pressed across her lips. When she blinked, they were gone. The bed was normal. The room was still. But the scar on her ankle, a perfect red ring, remained. They brought in salt, buckets of it, placed at every door, every window, every corner. Didn't help. Aika would stare at the salt until it hissed and turned black, ash-like, as if it had been burned by her gaze. The house had taken her side. More than that, it had merged with her. Naoko once tried to take Aika outside, force her to leave the house entirely. She thought perhaps distance would help, that the spirit, if that's what it was, would stay behind. But as soon as Aika crossed the threshold, she collapsed, convulsed. Red threads exploded out of her skin, lashing at the air, burrowing into the dirt and dragging her back toward the house like marionette strings. She didn't cry. She didn't speak, only stared. And the words from before returned, whispered, not by Aika, but from the walls, the floor, the very beams of the house. She tied me first. They began to understand then. It wasn't the house that was haunted. It was haunted because of her. No, because of what had been done to her. Or worse, because of what she was. Naoko became obsessed with old records, with village lore. She dug through the temple archives, questioned elders who barely remembered the old dialect. She scoured offerings, shrine etchings, even the burned edges of scrolls kept hidden in the school's cellar. And she found it, not in a book, but in a photo. A black and white image, grainy and water-stained, of another girl, standing in front of the same house, her face blurred, her hands tied in front of her, red thread around her ankles, not on them, in them. The caption on the back was written in charcoal, faded but just legible. Mina, 1931, the first one. Naoko brought the photo home. She didn't show Aika, not yet. She placed it inside the old altar drawer, behind the incense sticks, and beside the faded picture of her own mother. That night the drawer opened on its own. The photo vanished. The next morning it was pinned to the ceiling above Aika's bed, with thread. From then on the house changed again. Now it remembered. Old voices returned, whispering rituals, echoing prayers long abandoned. Visitors began to hear things even before entering. Children playing outside refused to walk past the gate. Dogs barked at the corners of the house, not at shadows, but at nothing, at the silence that moved. One evening, Hiroshi saw his reflection in the bathroom mirror, but it wasn't doing what he was doing. It smiled, tilted its head, and whispered, "You tried to cut her." They could no longer pretend. This was not a child, not anymore. She was something old, downed in flesh, not possessed, woven, a living vessel of karmic memory. And the house was not just listening. It was becoming her, a tangle of thread and grudge, of blood and memory, of binding. Naoko stood in the hallway late that night, her hand resting on the frame of Aika's door. Inside, the girl sat in stillness, the thread looped around her body like silk armor. The house was humming, not a song, not wind, but a low, ritual hum. Old, mournful. She wanted to speak, to say something, anything, but the words wouldn't come. Her throat felt stitched. And then Aika slowly turned to face her mother, just once, and mouthed something. Naoko didn't need to hear it. She already knew. "She tied me first."
Oban arrived quietly in Kurokami that year. No fireworks, no laughter, only smoke. Ash floated like pale insects in the air, drifting from incense sticks placed at the edge of doorways, windowsills, and family shrines. Paper lanterns swung on crooked hooks, their red ink smudged by rain. The village, cloaked in gray mist, breathed the way the dead might, slow, heavy, and patient. For generations, this was the time when families welcomed their ancestors back into their homes, a sacred reunion, a gentle tether between the living and the gone. But that summer, no one wanted visitors, not even the spiritual kind, especially not them. The villagers had begun avoiding the house entirely. Children crossed the street when passing it. Teenagers whispered stories about its hallway that echoed backwards, and one old man, Tanaka-san, who remembered the war, muttered that the moss growing on the roof spelled out someone's name. He refused to say whose. At the local temple, the head priest held longer services than usual. He added more salt, more sutras, more bells. But even he skipped Aika's family name when reading the ancestral registry aloud. The bell rang for every household in the valley, except theirs. Naoko didn't blame them. She had seen it too. The threads had changed. They no longer only creeped at night. Now they slithered in daylight, braiding themselves into corners of the room, hanging like cobwebs from lamps, curling around doorknobs that no one had touched. And Aika began to disappear. Not physically, but slowly, softly, she was fading into something else. She stopped eating altogether. Her skin turned translucent under certain lights. Once, Naoko saw a thread pass through her daughter's palm, not wrapping around it, but moving within it, like a vein that didn't belong. Hiroshi suggested sending her away. Naoko didn't respond. Where could they send her? She wasn't attached to the house. The house was attached to her. Oban night came with a red moon. The lanterns were lit, one for each soul to be welcomed home, but none were placed at Aika's gate. No candle for her ancestors, no food offering on her porch. She couldn't bring herself to do it. She didn't know what she would be inviting, not after what she'd found beneath the altar. The doll, wrapped in decayed thread, eyes scratched out, ankles cracked, and in its chest, an old nail, driven deep, black with rust, bound with red silk that still pulsed slightly when touched. In the village square, the festival struggled to feel like celebration. Drums were muted. Children ran less. The air was heavier than usual, as if someone had forgotten to open the spiritual window and let the dead back out. People whispered about it. The gate was never opened at the Kurokami house. They didn't burn the welcome fire. She was born during Ghost Month. It's too dangerous. But still, one family had placed an offering near their gate. A simple thing, a rice ball, a slice of pickled radish, and a folded prayer note. Naoko found it the next morning, untouched, but wrapped in a single red thread. Inside the rice was a fingernail, not old, not dead, fresh. That was the first night people heard the bells, not from the temple, from underground. Faint, metallic, distant, like something buried deep beneath the floorboards of Kurokami was trying to remind them it was still there. The priest claimed it was wind, or perhaps loose stone in the riverbed, but his eyes told another story. That same night, he hung a talisman outside the temple door, not for blessing, for warning. It bore a single character, Ketsu, the knot. Not a protective seal, but a binding. Naoko tried to prepare a simple altar at home, hoping to calm whatever presence stirred in their walls. She arranged fruit, lit incense, folded prayers. She chanted under her breath. She rang the old bell. And when she bowed in reverence to her family spirits, she heard it. A second bell, ringing back from inside the house. 3 slow chimes, not matching hers, answering hers. She stood frozen. And then Aika appeared at the doorway, thread trailing behind her like shadow. Her lips moved, but no sound came out, only smoke. The incense had turned black. Later that evening, a group of children played at the edge of the forest, near the path that led to the Kurokami shrine. They found a thread stretched across the path. Red, thin, vibrating like a plucked string. The bravest of them, a boy named Riku, tried to step over it. He didn't scream when he vanished, but the other children did. The police found nothing, no prints, no clothing, but a single thread had woven itself into the bark of a nearby tree, wrapped tight, the same width as a small ankle. Naoko stopped sleeping altogether. She wandered the halls of the house at night, candle in hand, afraid to blink for too long. She heard the whispers now, everywhere, in the cracks of the walls, in the folds of the curtains, inside the drains. Once she opened her mouth to pray, and the words came out in a voice that wasn't hers, too old, too wet, like someone speaking through soaked cloth. She bit her own tongue to stop it. By the third night of Oban, the final night, the village lit farewell fires. Tiny boats were released into the river, each carrying candles and prayers to guide the souls back to the other side. Naoko didn't attend, but she watched from the window, and what she saw made her blood freeze. Aika was outside, standing by the water. Her eyes were open, but they reflected no light. The threads at her ankles slithered into the grass, disappearing beneath the earth, as if pulling something out. And beside her, a second figure, blurred, gray. Not a person, not fully. A woman, perhaps, draped in old robes, face hidden behind a long curtain of black hair, arms extended toward Aika, not to embrace her, but to tie something around her wrists. Naoko gasped, and the woman's head slowly turned toward the window. Though her face was hidden, she could feel it, the recognition, the grudge, the claim. Aika returned at dawn, barefoot, her legs streaked with dried blood. She said nothing, but on her wrists were two faint lines, thin, red, as if someone had just begun tying the ends. The villagers called her Mukuchi now, the mute. But it wasn't always silence that unnerved them. It was how she listened. She listened like she was remembering something you hadn't said yet. Aika had not spoken since the words, "She tied me first," and even that had not been a scream or a cry or a plea. It had been a confession, a whisper peeled off the underside of her spirit. Now she wandered the house without sound. She stepped without echo, passed through rooms without stirring air. She sat in corners where shadows gathered unnaturally, where the red thread curved around her like a cradle woven by something with too many hands. Naoko would sometimes find her standing in front of the mirror for hours, not brushing her hair, not checking her face, just watching, like something else inside her was trying to recognize itself. One morning, Hiroshi found writing on the bathroom wall. Not in ink, in thread. Red strands woven into characters, kanji, old and unused, forming one phrase. She found her mouth inside mine. He blamed Aika, but Aika didn't flinch when confronted. She simply opened her mouth wide, and inside they saw something that did not belong. A tooth, small, yellowed, not hers. A child's baby tooth tucked beneath her tongue, fused to the skin with fine red thread. They tried to remove it. It screamed. That was the first time Hiroshi hit the floor without being touched. His ankles twisted under him, his body slammed to the tatami as if dropped from a height.
He choked, eyes wide, trying to speak. Aika stood in the hallway, watching, saying nothing. But the walls around him echoed with her name, not his voice, not Naoko's, but someone else's. Someone who had been waiting inside the grain of the floor, inside the wood of the beams, calling her. Aika, 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 as if the house had finally learned her name. After that, Hiroshi moved out. He said it was for safety. Naoko didn't ask whose. Aika spent more time under the house now. The crawl space, once used for storage, had been cleared by something unseen. Naoko found old boxes pushed to the side, as if carefully rearranged. Threads led beneath the floorboards, through a small opening no one remembered cutting. Sometimes Naoko would wake in the night and hear humming. Not from Aika's room, from beneath it, from below the floor. A slow, dragging melody, too old to belong to a child. One night, she gathered the courage to look. Candle in hand, she crept to the entrance of the crawl space. Dust choked the air. Spiderwebs sagged with moisture. And there, in the farthest corner, she saw her daughter, or something shaped like her. Back turned, kneeling, thread spilling from her mouth like red mist. She hummed as if trying to remember a lullaby sung to someone who had never been born. Naoko called her name. No response. She stepped forward. The candle flickered. A thread touched her ankle, and she heard it, not out loud, but inside her head, as clear as a thought she didn't create. I don't speak because she still listens. The next morning, Aika was back in bed. No dirt, no dust, no trace of her nighttime ritual, but her pillow was soaked with something red. Not blood, ink. And on her wall, drawn in delicate brushstrokes, a symbol Naoko had only seen once before, carved above the door of the sealed shrine in the forest. Fu, to seal, to imprison. Naoko tried to leave, packed a bag, opened the door, only to find every window nailed shut from the inside. Not with nails, with thread, tensioned so tightly the wood creaked under it, and across the doorframe dozens of tiny paper dolls had been pasted, each one handmade, each one faceless, each one tied at the ankles. She didn't remember making them, but her fingerprints were on every one. The villagers kept their distance, but some began to dream. Of a sobbing girl tied by her feet, of waking up with bleeding ankles, of lying on a cold floor, watching threads crawl across the ceiling, whispering secrets in voices that sounded like their dead mothers. They tried to ignore it, but dreams turned to memories, memories that didn't belong to them. One man, Yamato, ran screaming through the temple, claiming he had killed a baby in his youth, wrapped it in thread and buried it behind the shrine. He had no children, but his ankles were bruised, ringed with something tight and invisible. He didn't come back the next day. Just a pile of salt where he had last stood, and a single thread curling toward the woods. Naoko was breaking. She couldn't sleep, couldn't pray, couldn't stop remembering things that weren't hers. The smell of wet stone, the feel of thread slicing through flesh, the sound of a baby crying underground. And through it all, Aika's silence screamed louder than any voice. One night, Aika stood outside Naoko's bedroom, not moving, just
breathing. Naoko stared at her through the cracked door, and for a moment, just one unbearable second, Aika opened her mouth. Inside wasn't a tongue. Inside was thread, knotted, wet, moving. And Naoko finally understood. She wasn't keeping quiet. She couldn't speak, because every word, every sound, every scream was already occupied. The house no longer creaked, it whispered. Every movement in the wood now carried intention, as though someone unseen were shifting beneath the floorboards, rearranging bones, rehearsing a memory long forgotten. The whispers began as faint sounds, the brushing of thread, the soft creak of pressure where no one walked, the breath of damp wood exhaling secrets in the night. But soon they began to form words. Naoko heard them first. Short phrases, broken, fragmented like prayers half buried in salt. "Too tight," she said, "too tight. Don't tie me, I'm awake. Her mouth is mine." At first, Naoko thought it was the wind. Then she heard her name from beneath her pillow. She tore open the mattress in a panic. Inside, not feathers, not cotton, red threads, hundreds of them, knotted, looping, moving slightly as if breathing. She didn't scream. Screaming no longer helped. The villagers began waking with pain in their legs. Not illness, not age, marks, perfect red lines around their ankles. Some bled, some didn't. A boy named Tetsuo woke one morning sobbing, not from fear, but from a dream he couldn't explain. He said he'd been standing in Aika's house, but it wasn't hers anymore. It was made of thread, of pulsing walls, of voices in the ceiling that kept asking, "Whose feet do you walk with?" His mother said it was just a nightmare, until she pulled off his blanket and found a doll, wrapped in red silk, with Tetsuo's name stitched into its back. In the following days, the whispers grew louder. Now they came through the walls, through pipes, through radios that had long since broken. Even the trees outside the Kuro house began to lean closer, their branches brushing against the windows like curious hands. One woman, Emiko, swore her mirror spoke to her, not her reflection, the mirror. It told her to tie her daughter's legs at night, to keep the ghost from walking into her. She obeyed. By morning, the thread had replaced the rope, and her daughter no longer remembered her name. The priest returned, reluctantly. He came at dusk, wearing 3 layers of white. He brought wards, incense, salt, and a wooden staff carved with sutras. He refused to enter the Kuro house. Instead, he knelt outside the gate and read aloud from the oldest scroll he owned, one he had never dared touch before. The wind howled, crows screamed, and in the center of the house, Aika tilted her head. For the first time in days, she moved. Slowly she approached the window. She looked down at the priest and smiled. The priest choked mid-sentence. His throat stopped working. He dropped the scroll, and from his mouth a red thread slithered out, long, wet, pulled from deep within. He lived, but when asked his name at the hospital, he only wept and muttered, "She's not the girl. The girl is the echo." Naoko stopped entering Aika's room. The door moved on its own now, sometimes opening, sometimes closing, sometimes breathing. She once left food outside the door, only to return to find the tray gone, replaced by a line of baby teeth and a torn strip of fabric from her own wedding dress. She didn't open it again. But every night, the same whisper came from behind the paper wall. "Lie down, I'll tie you in." The villagers began sealing their doors with rope and talismans. Children wore bells around their ankles. Women slept with thread scissors beneath their pillows. But the whispers followed, in dreams, in silence, in the still water of washing basins, which now rippled with unseen hands. They whispered memories that didn't belong to them. One farmer heard the voice of his stillborn son. One widow heard her husband call from beneath her floor. One child heard a woman crying in the back of her throat. The village held a meeting, late at night, in the temple, by candlelight. They spoke of sealing the house, of burning it, of removing the girl. But no one dared say her name, because when they tried, their mouths stung, as if the syllables were no longer theirs to use. And then, from the back of the room, a sound, dragging, whispering, and the temple bell began to ring, not by hand, but from beneath the altar. The whispers were no longer confined to Aika's home. They lived in the dust, in the gaps between footsteps, in the air between two people trying not to look afraid. Every time someone said, "It's just the wind," they heard laughter, low, female, familiar, and far too close. Naoko had given up sleep. She spent her nights in the hallway, clutching an old photograph she didn't remember taking, a photo of her daughter standing beside a well. Aika's eyes were black, and her shadow wore a different face. One evening, she pressed her ear to the floor and finally understood. The whispers were not random. They were coming from beneath the house, but not from Aika, from another girl. A girl trapped in the beams, in the wood, in the foundation, sobbing, whispering, singing lullabies in a voice identical to her daughter's. And over again she begged, "Tie me again, I'm coming loose. Tie me again before she finds a mouth."
The scissors had been blessed. Old iron, wrapped in white silk, dipped in salt water from the mountain spring, and passed through 3 circles of fire under the guidance of the oldest living monk in the neighboring province. The ritual had a name that no one spoke aloud, not out of reverence, but out of fear that saying it would invite its opposite, a binding instead of a release. They were meant for severing possession, for cutting through the invisible cords that yoked the living to the dead. But these were not invisible. These were red, tangible, woven from something older than prayer, and they pulsed. Naoko didn't want to try, but she had run out of waiting. Hiroshi had never returned. The priest had gone mute, and Aika no longer moved like a girl. She floated when she walked, not rising off the ground, but unconnected from it. Her steps were weightless. Her eyes no longer reflected light. When Naoko looked into them, she saw thread, endless, spinning inwards like a tunnel without end. So she waited for her daughter to sleep, and she brought the scissors. The air was still that night, the kind of still that only comes before a storm no one sees coming. Aika's room was colder than the rest of the house. Her bed had sunken in slightly, as if the floor beneath it was soft, rotting, or breathing. The threads had multiplied, hundreds of them now, crisscrossing the walls and ceiling,
tied in patterns that made no sense, yet drew the eye like symbols, not meant to be remembered, but felt. Naoko stepped carefully. She knelt beside the bed. The scissors trembled in her hand. Aika lay still, her arms folded across her chest, as if placed that way. Naoko whispered a prayer and reached for the thread around her daughter's ankle. It was warm, pulsing, alive. She pressed the blade to it and began to cut. The scream wasn't hers. It wasn't Aika's. It came from beneath the house, a shriek, high and wet, like lungs filled with blood trying to push out air that didn't want to leave. The thread jerked violently and wrapped around the scissors, tight. Naoko gasped and tried to pull back. Too late. The scissors shook in her hands, then twisted, then snapped in half with a sound like bones splitting. The broken half drove itself into the wall. The other half vanished, pulled down by the thread into the floor. Gone. Aika's eyes opened, and she spoke. Not a sentence, not a word, just a sound, a moan of mourning, not for herself, but for something else, for something older. And then she whispered, "You can't cut what was never yours." Naoko fell back, shaking. The thread slithered from the bed like a living thing, wrapping around her ankle before she could rise. She screamed. The house answered. From every wall, floorboard, corner, whispers, hundreds of them. Not voices, mouths, small, ancient mouths breathing through the architecture of the home, repeating one phrase over and over. "She tied me first. She tied me first. She tied me first." Naoko passed out before dawn. When she woke, the thread was gone from her ankle, but a red mark remained. Not a cut, a symbol, etched into her skin like a birthmark, a loop, a knot, and something wriggling beneath it. She tried to flee, but the house wouldn't let her. The doors refused to open. The windows showed scenes that weren't real, images of her childhood warped by grief, stitched together with memories that never happened. She saw her mother again, holding a baby, only it wasn't her. The baby had threads instead of limbs, and the woman's mouth had been sewn shut with the same red silk. That night, Naoko tore up the floorboards. She had to find where the thread began. She had to know what was beneath the house. Aika didn't stop her. Aika watched, silently, as if she too wanted to know. The floor gave way easier than expected. Rotten wood, damp earth, and beneath it, old stones, etched with names. Not grave markers, not quite. Each stone was carved with one character, Yule, not, and beneath them, bones. Not buried properly, stacked, folded, tied. Every skeleton had red thread wrapped around its limbs, mouths bound shut, eyes missing, dozens of them. Children. Naoko fell to her knees. She realized what the house was, not a home, a shrine, not to a god, to a curse. Every thread, every wall, every creak, built on top of pain, on top of silence, on top of something that was never meant to wake. And now it had. That night, Naoko entered her mother's room. She sat at the foot of the bed, no longer floating, but grounded, heavy, like something had returned to her. Her skin was colder now, her breath slower, and when she spoke, her voice was no longer a child's. It was two voices layered, one soft, one angry. You should have let her sleep. Naoko swallowed her fear and whispered, "Who is she?" Aika tilted her head, then smiled. She was never born, so she made her hers.
Long before the house, before the threads, before the girl who didn't speak, there was the well. It sat half hidden in the trees beyond Kurokami, forgotten even by those who remembered everything else. No paths led to it. No prayers were left at its mouth. Only silence. And silence in this village was never empty. Naoko first heard about the well from a whisper. Not a person. A page. One torn from an ancient ledger buried deep in the archives beneath the temple. Charred at the edges, half erased. But what remained chilled her blood. When the seal fails, bury her face down, thread the mouth, bind the ankles, and cast her to the well. No name, no context, only a date, August 1931. The same year as the photo, the same year as Mina. Naoko packed a lantern and a rusted shovel. She didn't ask permission. No one in the village would have given it. They didn't speak of the well, because some secrets protect themselves through fear. But she had no fear left, only questions, and threads wrapping tighter around her life. The forest swallowed her within minutes. The deeper she walked, the quieter the world became. Birds vanished, bugs stilled. Even her own footsteps felt muffled, as if the trees absorbed sound like old walls absorb grief. She moved by instinct, drawn, or maybe pulled. A single red thread trailed behind her, winding through the roots, leading her deeper like a breadcrumb made of blood. It wasn't coming from her pocket. It was coming from beneath the trees. The well revealed itself, not with sight, but with a feeling. A sudden heaviness in her lungs, a shift in gravity. And then, there it was, circular, stone, cracked with age, covered in moss and talismans so old their ink had faded into the paper like veins. Some were written in kanji no one used anymore. One word repeated across all of them. Pei, to close, to seal, to trap. Naoko stepped forward. The red thread slipped down into the mouth of the well, disappearing into its darkness like it was returning home. She raised the lantern, looked down, saw nothing, just endless black. But she heard something. Not echoes, wet breathing, soft, labored, like someone trying not to drown or trying not to forget they already had. She dropped a stone in. No splash, no bottom, only a sound. Not below, behind. She turned and froze. A figure stood at the edge of the clearing, draped in white, hair over the face, feet bare and bruised, and around her ankles, red thread. Aika? No. Too tall. Too wrong. The figure tilted its head, and from beneath the curtain of hair, a voice whispered,
I died without a mouth, so now I wear yours." Naoko ran. Branches clawed at her, roots tried to trip her. The red thread snaked around her ankles, tightening, but she kept moving, kept breathing, until she burst through the trees and back into daylight, lungs burning, thread gone. But the voice followed her home. That night, it echoed through the house, not from Aika, from the walls. She died where no water lives, and now she wants your breath to float again. The next morning, Aika was gone. No footprints, no sign of struggle, only her blanket, folded neatly, and a single drop of black water on the floor. Naoko knew. She went back to the forest. This time she didn't hesitate. She climbed onto the edge of the well, looked down, whispered, "Take me," and jumped. She didn't fall. She sank. Through air, through time, through memories not her own. She saw flashes, a shrine burning, a baby screaming, a midwife covering her ears while threads wrapped around a crib, villagers chanting, and a girl face down in a well with her mouth sewn shut and a red thread tied from ankle to ankle, so tight it cut into the bone. Mina, not buried, offered, to contain something, to trap something inside her. But Mina had died empty, and empty vessels never stay silent. Naoko woke at the base of the well, covered in moss, dirt in her mouth, and across her wrists, new lines, red, burning. Thread had been tied, but not to bind her, to connect her. She was no longer outside the curse. She was part of its knot. And when she returned to the house, Aika was waiting, standing in the doorway, hair gently blowing in a wind that didn't exist. And for the first time, she spoke, not with her own voice, but with both, layered, like two souls speaking through the same mouth. "You brought me home. Now I'll show you where I was buried."
The rain never stopped after Naoko came back from the well. It didn't pour, it seeped. Through walls, through wood, through skin. The village said nothing, but windows stayed closed, temples burned incense longer, and even the birds that once nested along the shrine's roofline migrated early that year, because they knew something had returned, something tied, and it brought her with it. Naoko found Aika standing at the center of the house. Her feet were bare, but the threads beneath her had formed a perfect circle, a weaving of red silk that shimmered like blood in candlelight. She was not alone. Though no one else was visible, the air hummed with presence. The floor pulsed, the ceiling bowed, and the scent in the room was thick with water that had never seen sunlight. Naoko didn't speak. She couldn't. Her throat had tightened, not from fear, but from memory. She had seen this before, in her dream, in her grandmother's stories, in that single torn page from the temple's forbidden ledger. The binding circle. Aika raised her head. Her eyes were wrong. Still hers, but something behind them blinked too. And then she spoke. Her voice was layered, like a chorus whispering through a cracked throat. I asked her not to,
but she tied me anyway. Naoko stepped forward, slowly. She whispered, "Who tied you?" Aika tilted her head, smiled, and pointed to Naoko's hands. The memory came like a thread pulled tight. Naoko saw herself young, frightened, bleeding from childbirth. She had been told only one survived, her daughter, Aika. But that wasn't the whole truth. There had been 2 heartbeats, 2 babies, one still, one silent. But the midwife had whispered, "We can't let her cry. Tie her before the soul finds its voice." So they had wrapped red thread around the silent one. Ankles, wrists, mouth. They'd placed her in a wooden box and taken her to the well. Naoko had forgotten, or been made to forget, until now. Tears streamed down her cheeks. She fell to her knees. "I didn't know." But Aika's voice dropped into something colder. "You did, but you chose the one who breathed." Naoko sobbed, "I'm sorry." But Aika shook her head. "I wasn't the one she wanted. She followed your breath. She entered me because you gave her no mouth of her own." The house groaned. Every wall, every beam, every floorboard began to bleed thread, long, glistening red lines that crawled like veins. And then the second voice emerged, not from Aika, but from beneath her, a wet, broken voice gasping through imaginary lungs. "She tied me first, so I took her name. I took her blood. I took her house." The floor cracked open. Naoko screamed. Aika didn't fall. She descended, slowly, as if being lowered by invisible hands. Naoko lunged forward. The thread caught her by the ankle. She fell, crawled, reached, and grabbed Aika's wrist. It burned her palm, but she didn't let go. "Come back! You're not her!" she cried. Aika turned. For a moment, just one, her eyes softened. A flicker of recognition. A child beneath the curse. A girl beneath the thread. And she whispered, "She's deeper than I am." Then Aika vanished into the dark. Naoko sat alone in the house. The rain had stopped, but the silence was worse, because it was full, heavy, expectant. And behind her, the walls whispered, "Now that you remember, tie the next." That night she dreamed of the box, the one they placed in the well, the one with no name. She saw her daughter's twin, mouth stitched shut, hands bound behind her back, face down, but alive, buried before the soul could finish entering the body, sealed, not to protect the village, but to protect her, because she had been born during Ghost Month, because she had opened her eyes before she took her first breath, because some children are empty when born, and something else fills them. Naoko woke up with thread wrapped around her fingers, but not from Aika, from her own hands. She'd tied herself in her sleep. And on the wall, in thread, a message had appeared. "Untie me, or join me." The trapdoor was never visible. Naoko found it by sound. the soft creaking that had always echoed beneath the hallway, the one she thought was plumbing or shifting wood or old bones settling in their grief. But now she listened closer, and the floor responded. When she stepped in the center of the corridor, just past Ikka's door, the whispering grew louder. It wasn't just voices, it was weeping. The kind of mourning that didn't seek comfort, the kind that had forgotten why it cried, but couldn't stop. Naoko pressed her hands to the floor, and there, hidden beneath paper, beneath wood, beneath decades of dirt and silence, she felt it. A seam, and within that seam, breath. She pried it open with a kitchen knife. The boards lifted easier than she expected, like something had been waiting to be found. The air that rose from below was cold, not from temperature, but from emptiness, as if it had never been breathed by the living. The morning room lay beneath the house like a bruise no one admitted to. Low ceiling, damp walls, tatami mats rotted with mildew. But it wasn't the room itself that made Naoko shiver. It was what lined the walls. Photographs. Hundreds of them. Old, black and white, sepia-toned. All children, all unsmiling, and every single one had red thread looped around their ankles in ink, as if someone had drawn it after the photo was taken. Some had thread around their mouths, others across their eyes. And in the farthest corner, framed in cracked glass, the one photo she had tried to forget. Mina, the other child, the one who didn't breathe. Only now Naoko saw the truth in the background. In the shadows behind Mina, just barely visible, a pair of hands holding the thread, her hands. The weeping began again, not from the photo, from the floor. Naoko pulled back the mats. There was another trapdoor, older, carved with kanji too faded to read, except for one, mourning. She opened it and saw stairs descending into stone. The steps were wet, each one slick with something dark. Thread clung to the walls like vines. She descended slowly, holding a candle in her palm like it was the last warm thing she had. The deeper she went, the louder the voices became. They didn't speak in words anymore. They remembered. She could hear it in their cadence. Lullabies sung before burial. Prayers whispered to babies that were never meant to grow. And that one phrase, always repeating, always circling, "She tied me first." The room at the bottom was circular, stone. A single futon sat in the center, clean, undisturbed, as if someone had just risen from it. Around it, the walls were covered in writing, thread stitched into the stone itself, a language made of sorrow. Naoko stepped forward. Her feet were bare now. She didn't remember removing her shoes. The floor was warm, like skin. And when she knelt beside the futon, she saw it, a small bundle, wrapped in red. She reached out, but it moved. The bundle uncoiled, and within it, a doll, handmade, stuffed with rice, eyes sewn shut, and a mouth missing entirely, just skin, stretched, smooth. Naoko cradled it in her hands. It was cold, and then it whispered, I was never buried, only forgotten. The candle flickered, and the room changed. Suddenly she was not alone. The walls pulsed. Shapes emerged. Not people, but presences. Mothers, fathers, midwives, all watching, all silent. And at the far side of the room a woman appeared, pale, dripping, with thread pouring from her mouth like water. She walked toward Naoko, kneeling slowly, placing her hands over the doll, and then placed one hand on Naoko's chest. Naoko gasped. Her heart stopped, not with pain, but with recognition. The woman whispered, "You didn't mourn me. You sealed me. Now open the thread." Naoko looked down. The doll was gone. In its place, her own daughter, Ika, eyes closed, skin cold, thread tied tightly at the wrists, ankles, and mouth. And then Akka opened her eyes. One word escaped her lips, though bound. It was felt, not heard. "Mama." Naoko screamed, pulled the thread from Akka's mouth. Blood rushed from it like ink spilled on paper. She coughed, eyes clearing, breath returning, and the room began to crumble. The presences screamed, the walls bled, and the ceiling rained red thread like hair falling from a corpse. Naoko held Akka close. "I see you. You're not her. You never were." But from behind them, the voice returned, wet, envious. "But she was tied with your hands, and so were you." They escaped the room as it collapsed. The house groaned above them. Futons flipped, walls cracked, and through the hallway thread unraveled like veins pulled from a dying body. The house was shedding, rejecting them, or releasing them. It was impossible to tell. They emerged at dawn. The sky above Kurokami was clear, for the first time in weeks. The thread was gone, but so was the house. It didn't burn. It dissolved, like salt in rain. And in the wind, Naoko heard it one last time. "The morning room is always waiting for the next who forgets to weep." She was the last one left alive who remembered the old ways. Her name was Suga. No one said it aloud anymore, not out of disrespect, but out of quiet superstition, as if summoning her name might summon her silence too. Suga had delivered more than half the village's children, but she had buried just as many. And some said she knew how to speak to spirits, or at least how to keep them quiet. Naoko found her in the foothills beyond Kurokami, alone, blind, still alive. She lived in a hut made of cedar and straw, surrounded by cracked jars and wind chimes made from the teeth of infants who never cried. When Naoko stepped onto the porch, the chimes fell silent. Suga was already waiting, as if she'd been listening all along. "You came too late?" the old woman rasped. Naoko lowered her head. "I remember now." Suga nodded. "You weren't meant to." Inside, the walls were covered in parchment, each one inscribed with ink and blood. Prayers, seals, sigils, all drawn in loops and knots. Suga motioned toward a stool. "Sit. Let me tell you about the day your daughter was born." Naoko sat, hand shaking, and Suga began. It was the 7th day of Ghost Month. The air was too hot for August, too still. No wind to carry the dead away. You were in labor. There were 2 heartbeats, one strong, one strange. One belonged to the child you named Aika. The other, she paused. The other belonged to something else. Suga lit a small bowl of incense. The smoke curled upward, forming a spiral above their heads. She came first, the midwife continued. The quiet one, no breath, but her eyes opened before she passed. Naoko felt her stomach twist. She wasn't dead. She was inhabited. There was a ritual, she whispered, for such births. If the child does not cry, if the child is born silent but sees, you must bind her mouth and bury her before the soul settles. Naoko whispered, "Why didn't you tell me then?" Suga shook her head. "I did. You screamed. You refused. And then," her voice faltered, "you tied the thread yourself." Naoko's vision blurred. She remembered now. The infant too still, eyes wide open, watching her mother through a veil of silence. She had been afraid, not of the baby, but of what was behind her eyes. A darkness without age, a hunger without form. And in that moment, the thread had felt like mercy. "I thought I was protecting Aika." "You were, but you forgot one thing." Naoko looked up. Suga leaned forward, her milky eyes shining with regret. "She wasn't just a ghost. She was a twin." The incense turned black, the smoke stilled, and the wind outside stopped. Suga stood slowly. Twins are bound beyond the womb. They share blood, they share silence, and if one is sealed, she placed a small hand over her chest, the other becomes a doorway. Naoko rose. She felt it now, not guilt, not shame, understanding. Aika had never been cursed. She had been connected. And every whisper, every thread, every bleeding ankle had been the other trying to come back, to take what she was denied, a mouth, a name, a mother. Suga handed her a small pouch. Inside, a needle, thread, and an old photograph Naoko had never seen before. 2 infants, one swaddled in blue, the other already bound. "Finish the ritual," Suga said, "but this time not with fear, but with choice." Naoko left at dusk. Behind her, the wind began again, but the chimes did not ring. The midwife had already died. Sitting with her head bowed, the story told, the silence passed on. That night, Naoko returned home to find Aika sitting at the edge of the new house, a quiet place outside the village, far from the old floorboards and the bleeding walls. Aika looked up at her, eyes tired but clear. "I dream of her," she whispered. "I know. Does she still want me?" Naoko knelt beside her. "No, she wants what you were never given. A body? No, a goodbye." Aika opened her palm. Inside was the broken tooth Naoko had found years ago, the one that didn't belong. She placed it on the floor, and together they wrapped it in thread, not to bind, but to send off, to release. As the moon rose, Naoko lit incense. This time she spoke the name aloud, not Aika, Mina. the name she had never spoken, the name she had buried. And as the smoke curled into the wind, Naoko whispered, "You were seen, you were mine, but you don't have to stay." Outside, a single chime rang once, and then broke.
They thought it was over. The house had dissolved, the morning room collapsed, the name Mina had finally been spoken. But curses don't vanish. They drift, they wait. And when the village of Kurokami exhaled its first sigh of relief in decades, that's when the red threads returned. It began quietly. A woman named Hana awoke in the middle of the night to find her daughter gone. The doors were still locked, the windows shut. But there, in the center of the room, lay a perfect circle of thread. Inside it, her daughter's hair ribbon, still tied, still warm. The girl was found the next day, sitting at the old well in the forest, barefoot, eyes open, humming a lullaby she had never been taught. Across the village, strange things bloomed. Not flowers, not mold, but knots, appearing in rope, in fishing nets, in bundles of straw left overnight, even in the smoke of cooking fires, curling into patterns ancient and unfamiliar. The elders recognized it. They remembered this from long ago, the year of Mina. But they didn't speak it aloud. They knew better to name what still listened. Red threads began to appear beneath doors, wrapped around doorknobs, tangled in hair. Villagers reported waking up with their limbs bound in dreams, not tightly, not violently, but deliberately, as if someone was measuring them, fitting them, preparing them. And all throughout the town, one phrase began repeating itself on mirrors, on fogged windows, even in the lines of cracked teacups. It's her turn now. Naoko watched from the edge of it all. She had taken Aika far into the northern hills, a place without names, where no threads could reach, or so she believed. But one night, she awoke to find Aika standing at the doorway, barefoot in the snow, eyes closed, whispering. Not in fear, in comfort, like she was speaking to someone she had once shared a body with. Naoko whispered. Her daughter opened her eyes slowly. She's not angry anymore. Naoko stepped forward. She's gone? Aika shook her head. No, she's everywhere now. Naoko felt it then, the cold in the walls, the thread coiling through the ceiling beams. Even this new house, untouched by Kurokami, was being traced, not by malice, but by memory. The curse had softened, but it had not stopped. It had changed. That day they returned to the village, together, not as victims, but as witnesses, to see what remained, to face what was still unfinished. The old shrine was the heart of it. It had stood for centuries, even when every other building had been rebuilt. Naoko and Aika approached its steps, each one lined with salt, disturbed. The door hung crooked. Inside, the statues were blindfolded. The altar bowl was overturned. And in the center of the tatami floor, a pattern, woven in thousands of threads, perfectly symmetrical, a sigil, a map, a message. Aika knelt beside it, ran her hand across the center. There's one left, she whispered. Naoko stared. One what? Aika looked up. One girl. Still tied, still waiting. That night the village slept uneasily, not because of fear, but because of pulling, as if each person's dreams were being drawn toward a center, not stolen, not poisoned, but gathered.
And when the villagers awoke, they each found the same thing, a single red thread tied around the foot of their beds, knotted gently. Naoko gathered the villagers that morning. For once, no one protested. They stood around the shrine barefoot, solemn, and Aipa stepped forward. She held the final bundle, wrapped in white cloth. Inside, the last piece of Mina, a lock of hair, preserved, tied with thread. Naoko lit the incense. Aika placed the bundle at the shrine, and the wind moved for the first time in weeks. It carried a whisper through the trees, through the houses, through the bones of the mountain. Thank you. That night, the red threads burned away on their own. No fire, no smoke, just disappearance, unwinding into dust, leaving behind no curse, no wound, only memory. Aika slept for 2 days straight. When she woke, her eyes were hers again. No echoes, no shadows, just peace. And Naoko finally understood. It had never been about punishment. It had been about recognition. All Mina had ever wanted was to be seen, not as a ghost, not as a curse, but as a girl who was never held, never named, never mourned. Now she was.
Beneath the shrine, there was a room no one spoke of. Not in words, not in dreams. It didn't appear on the village blueprints. It wasn't recorded in any monk's scroll. But every elder knew it existed, and every child felt it when passing by. The weight beneath the floorboards, the hush in the trees, the soft, steady pressure of something listening below. Aika dreamed of it first. She saw a door made of stone, sealed with ash and blood, wrapped in woven reeds. She saw hands, hundreds of them, pressing against it from the inside, and in the center, a mouth opened where no face should have been, whispering, "You buried me hungry." When she awoke, her hands were wet, and in her palms, grains of uncooked rice, offerings from a room she had never entered. Naoko didn't want to go back to the shrine, but the threads had returned. Only one this time, a single red line emerging from the altar like a vein, coiling down through a crack in the floor, as if inviting them or warning them. They brought lanterns and nothing else. No salt, no charms. This wasn't a battle. It was a reckoning. The stairs beneath the shrine were older than the village itself, carved into the mountain, damp with breath, lined with talismans that had long since lost their ink. Each step forward felt like walking deeper into the earth's memory. The offering room revealed itself not with space, but with silence. Sound changed as they entered. The air thinned, the lanterns dimmed, and the walls began to hum. Not a vibration, a voice. Dozens of voices, layered in a sound that lived between words. Aika clutched her mother's arm. "I know this place," she whispered. Naoko nodded. "So do I." The room was circular, the floor dirt packed so tight it echoed. In the center, a stone altar, split, as if something had once tried to rise from beneath it. Around it, remnants of offerings remained: dried peaches, coins with holes, wooden dolls missing limbs. But what caught Naoko's eye was the scroll, pinned to the altar with a bone needle. It pulsed with red ink, still wet. She stepped forward and read it aloud. One line, ancient dialect, barely legible. The thread must be fed, or it will search for a mouth. Suddenly, the lanterns flickered, the floor trembled, and from beneath the altar, a sound emerged, like a child coughing through water, then breathing, then laughing, low, wet, unnatural. Aika stepped back. Naoko pulled her close. The altar cracked again. A hand rose from the earth, small, pale, tied at the wrist with fraying red thread. They didn't scream. They couldn't. A second hand followed, then arms, then a figure began to emerge, not fully formed, not human, not whole. A patchwork of limbs and sorrow made from every buried offering, from every name that was never spoken, from every child sealed in silence. It didn't move toward them. It didn't need to. It was already inside them. Naoko dropped to her knees. Aika followed. The figure reached out, not to grab, to receive. Naoko understood. She removed the thread from her wrist, the one she had tied that first night after birth, the one she had kept in a box ever since. She placed it on the altar. Aika did the same. A lock of hair, a piece of cloth, a tooth, not hers. All the relics of grief, all the things they had carried instead of saying goodbye. The figure paused, then smiled. It didn't vanish, it unraveled into thread, into dust, into breath. And as it dissolved into the room, the walls sighed, the mountain exhaled, and for the first time in 100 years, the shrine was empty, truly empty. Naoko looked at her daughter. "Do you feel it?" Aika nodded. "It's quiet now." "Is she gone?" "No," Aika said softly. "She's home." As they climbed the stairs back toward the world, the first rays of sunlight cracked through the shrine walls. Red threads once used to bind were now curling gently at their feet, fading, not with fear, but with release. Back in the village, no one asked what they had done, but that night every family placed rice and water by their doors. No names, no prayers, just offerings, in case anyone was still listening. There is a moment in every curse where it pauses, not to relent, but to ask, "Will you continue me, or will you carry me?" That moment had arrived. For days after the offering room was emptied, the village held its breath. No red thread, no bleeding ankles, no crying from beneath the floors. But in the silence that followed, there was still something unresolved, a knot left untied, not from fear, but from choice. Naoko felt it first, the weight of the bloodline pressing behind her eyes, a pressure that no longer whispered, but waited, in the folds of her skin, in the pauses between heartbeats, in the memories that weren't always hers. Aika had changed too. She spoke more now, but softly. Her voice had a rhythm to it, as though it echoed others, even when she was alone. She dreamed of places she had never been, names she had never heard, and once, while brushing her hair, Naoko saw a faint red line beneath the skin of Aika's neck. Not a thread, not a scar, a mark, a path. They returned to the shrine once more, one final time, not to bury, but to decide. Inside, the altar had remained silent, but a new thread had appeared in the dust, short, incomplete, waiting to be tied or cut. The village had gathered outside, silent, not in protest, in reverence, because they knew some curses do not end, they transfer. Some spirits do not fade, they choose. And the one who once had no name was watching now, not with malice, but with patience, like a story waiting to see how it would be remembered. Naoko stood before the altar, Aika beside her. In her hands a piece of thread, frayed, soft, almost crumbling. She held it out. This was the last one, the one I tied around your sister's ankle. Aika looked at it, then looked up at her mother. Do I have to wear it? She shook her head. No. She placed it on the altar and lit a match. But the thread did not burn. It wove itself into a knot, a perfect loop, still whole, still waiting. They stood in silence. Then, from the back of the shrine, a voice. The knot remembers, but it does not decide. It wasn't a ghost. It wasn't Mina. It was the voice of legacy, the echo of every mother who had ever made the choice before them, every woman who had sealed the mouth of grief. And now it was Naoko's turn. She stepped forward, held the thread. It pulsed once like a heartbeat. Then she tied it around her own wrist, not tightly, not fearfully, but knowingly. A full circle, a karmic knot, not to continue the curse, but to carry the memory. The wind picked up, the doors of the shrine opened on their own, and outside the villagers bowed, not in sorrow, in thanks. The curse had not been broken, it had been transformed. That night, Naoko slept peacefully for the first time in years. No whispers, no sobbing, only a single dream. She stood at the old well. Mina was there. Not a child, not a ghost, just a girl, whole, untied. She smiled and said only one thing. Now I remember too. Naoko woke with the thread still around her wrist, but it was no longer red. It had faded to white, like ash or memory.
It began again, not with blood, not with silence, but with a birth. Far from Kurokami, in a different village, under a sky that pulsed with late summer heat, a baby was born. A girl, healthy, breathing strong, eyes closed, but her cry came late. The nurse noted it, only a moment's pause. Still, enough to make the old midwife raise her head and mutter something in a dialect no one recognized. Something about thread, something about timing. The baby's mother held her close, counted her fingers, her toes, paused. At the ankles, 2 faint red lines. Not bruises, not birthmarks, but rings. Perfect, as if once tied, then carefully removed, like the memory of something no longer there. The midwife said nothing, but she lit a stick of incense by the window that night, a ritual no one had requested, a prayer no one heard, a habit passed down from mothers who remembered more than they spoke. In Kurokami, Naoko stirred in her sleep. She hadn't dreamed in months, but now something whispered. Not words, just a feeling, a tug, a pull, the kind a thread makes when it's been loosened, but not fully released. She woke before dawn, looked at her wrist. The white thread was gone, turned to dust, or carried away in the wind, and on her skin, just barely visible in the morning light,
a new circle, faint, warm, alive. Aika didn't speak of it, but she began to hum again, the same lullaby, low, gentle, the one no one ever taught her, the one she had once heard beneath the floorboards, sung by a voice with no mouth. In another part of the world, the newborn stirred in her crib. She did not cry. She only listened, to the wind, to the walls, to something inside her that was older than speech. And her mother, exhausted but smiling, leaned down and whispered, "You're safe." The child blinked, and for the briefest moment her gaze shifted not to her mother, but to the corner of the room, where a loose thread swayed gently from the curtain. Red, barely there, and then, still. No curse had returned, no spirit had awakened, but somewhere in the spaces between generations, a thread remembered what it once was. Not a chain, not a wound, but a question. Will you tie me, or will you listen? Outside the house, wind moved through the grass, soft, rhythmic, like breath, like footsteps, like the rustle of silk threads across ankles no longer bound, but never entirely free.